Welcome to Haunted Talks, the official podcast of The Haunted Walk, offering thematic walking tours and paranormal adventures in Kingston, Ottawa, and Toronto, Ontario. My name is Jim Dean. I am the creative director, and I really appreciate you joining us for the show. As we continue our tour of the best ghost tour companies in the world, today we head to one of the most iconic cities. The place so nice, they named it twice. New York, New York, the Big Apple. Overflowing with dark history and paranormal activity, we will be hearing all about it from our good friends at the awesomely named Boroughs of the Dead, Macabre, New York City walking tours. Before we get to that, I hate to say it, but we are now in the dog days of summer. The back-to-school ads are everywhere, and you're getting down to your final opportunities to join us on some of our adventures. Most notably, you have 2 weekends left to join us at Upper Canada Village in Morrisburg, Ontario, for our Haunted Walk experience there. And I've done that one a couple times myself, and it is so dark and creepy there. We have some great ghost stories, and the tickets for those are vanishing extremely quickly. So your last 2 dates to join us for that are Saturday, August 18th and Saturday, August 25th. You're not going to want to miss that one if you are anywhere close to Eastern Ontario. If you are in Western Ontario and want to have the experience of walking around a creepy pioneer village at night, I'd strongly encourage you to join us for our Haunted Walk experience at Black Creek Pioneer Village in Toronto, a place we routinely see some really strange activity in some of the old buildings that are there. That tour runs Thursdays, Friday, and Saturday nights through to September 2nd. And of course, those are only the tip of the iceberg. And we hope that if you live in Kingston, Ottawa, or Toronto, or will be visiting sometime soon, you will make us part of your plans. And information about all our tours can be found on our website, which is hauntedwalk.com. We also plan to announce our Halloween season schedule, which will run from the final week of September through to the first week of November this year, and we're releasing that very soon. So if you're interested in getting kind of first dibs on the best tickets, I'd strongly encourage you to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, all at Haunted Walk, so you'll be one of the first to hear when the tickets are up for sale. Finally, I did want to update you on our goal, which was to reach 55-star reviews on Apple Podcasts before the end of August. We've had quite a few of you do those recently, so thank you very much. And I would just encourage you, if you're enjoying the show, if you have a moment or two afterwards, just to give us that 5-star review. It really does mean the world to us and makes a big difference in helping people discover the program. So, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're listening to us, a 5-star review would be greatly, greatly appreciated. It looks like our tour bus has finally arrived. Can you believe the traffic here in New York? Absolutely incredible. I see our good friends from Boroughs of the Dead just over there at our meeting point. So everyone grab some snacks. I think it's going to be a great tour. And let's learn a little bit about the dark side of New York City.
I had been writing ghost stories and ghostly fiction, and I was really inspired by New York City because around the same time I was also becoming a licensed tour guide. And, there weren't, in 2009, when I became a licensed tour guide, there weren't that many ghost tours operating in the city. In 2011, I got my first job as a ghost tour guide, and I was really good at it, and I really loved it. And it was fun because, when you're writing short stories, you don't get that immediate feedback. Whereas in front of a live audience, you do, and it's really rewarding, and it's also really instructive for a writer. And so I just loved everything about it, and I got really addicted to it. And I would get scripts from my boss, and I would read them, and I'd be like, well, there's a lot more here that I want to talk about as well. And I would be researching and going off on my own and going on these crazy tangents. And I had this desire to create tours, because creating a tour is like creating this whole story, this whole narrative, but you have the added physicality of the city space that you're telling it in. And sometimes these things would line up perfectly, like in Lower Manhattan, because the way New York City grew and developed, It started at the lower southernmost tip of the island and grew northward. So you can actually stand there at the southern tip of Manhattan Island, kind of close to where the Staten Island Ferry is, and then walk northward past Wall Street towards City Hall Park. And with every step you take, you're physically moving through history. You're moving through space and time. And the histories are so dark and strange and often not talked about because they're quite sensitive, really. So, it was just this strange, dark, wonderful world mixed with the history of this fascinating, bizarre city. And I just got so addicted to it, and I wanted to do, as you can see from my website, I just want to do every square inch of New York City. My name is Andrea Janes, and I am the owner and founder of Boroughs of the Dead, Macabre New York City walking tours. One thing that makes New York such a wonderful haunted city to visit is that it's very old, relatively old by North American standards. And so there's a lot of history, and it's got a great weighty history. It's got a dark, violent past. So you have all the ingredients there for the perfect ghost tour. New York City, is, from the point of European contact, 400 years old, which is pretty old for the United States. And even before then, there were people living on Manhattan Island for 10,000 years. So, we have a lot that has happened here, and we have had a lot of human souls traverse this island because of the density of New York City's population. We've just had millions and millions of lives and deaths. And because of the character of New York City, the dramatic qualities of those lives has been pretty superlative. Lower Manhattan is going to give you the best kind of historical overview of the city if you really want to go back in time to the 1600s. And of course, because it's very dense, it's just chock-a-block with rich history. You can throw a stone and you'll find, where George Washington was inaugurated as president. You'll find amazing stuff in Lower Manhattan. And if you only have one weekend in New York City, I would recommend you go there.
Recently, I've really enjoyed speaking with other ghost tour operators, as everyone has their own unique take, their own spin on providing tours. I'm curious, what's different about Boroughs of the Dead?
I always refer to us kind of as ghost tours for book nerds. Ghost tours are wonderful things, and they're an incredible way to learn about the history of a city, and they're also really fun. And every tour operator takes the angle, as you said, that they enjoy most. And some really enjoy the dramatic qualities of it. And they enjoy dressing up, and they like lanterns, and they like capes, and they like the spooky factor. And those are really fun tours, and they have their own character. When we started Boroughs of the Dead, there was a foundation kind of in the love of New York City history. And also, a lot of us are writers. I wrote short horror fiction and short ghost stories. One of our tour guides writes what she calls Gothic gas lamp fiction. Her name is Liana Renee Heber, and if you like anything Gothic, Victorian, steampunk, you'll love her novels. So, as writers, we just always gravitated towards sort of the nerdy, literary, historical, we will be talking about Edgar Allan Poe and H.P. Lovecraft on our West Village tour. And when we talk about these writers, we'll kind of have a different approach maybe than another ghost tour. We'll talk a little bit more about the work, the themes of the work. We're less going to try and sell you on the idea that Poe was still sliding around some old banister in NYU, and we'll talk a little bit more about the qualities of his work. And I don't think that's any less interesting. I mean, it's, if you look at what he wrote, obviously it changed the face of literature forever. And also, it has a lot of points of contact with some of the more esoteric histories of New York City. Like Poe was really interested in mesmerism, for example, or hypnotism, as we call it sometimes nowadays. So he would go to these lectures about mesmerism, and he would meet people who called themselves mystics and who would go into trances, and he would watch them perform their mesmeric work, in these places with names like Fowler's Phrenological Cabinet, which was a place behind Barnum's Museum on Ann Street. downtown New York. And he would write about them, and he would incorporate these ideas into his stories. The Facts in the Case of Monsieur Valdemar is a story that he wrote after seeing some mesmeric lectures in New York City, and he wrote that while living on Amity Street, now West 3rd Street. So I think that's really interesting. I think it's interesting that the mystics that he saw included people like Andrew Jackson Davis, who called himself the Poughkeepsie Seer, and he used to go into these trances and speak in tongues, and he spoke in ancient Hebrew, apparently just receiving the knowledge of ancient Hebrew from the spirit world. And he had an advocate. There was a professor at New York University whose name was George Bush, and he was a professor of Hebrew, and he swore that Andrew Jackson Davis was the real deal. Like, he was really receiving direct spirit contact, instructing him in ancient Hebrew, and there's no way he could have known this language. He hadn't had the opportunity to study it, so he vouched for this mystic, this guy, this Poughkeepsie seer. Poughkeepsie is a small town in upstate New York, by the way. So when you think about it, that's interesting, because this professor of Hebrew, George Bush, at New York University, is an ancestor of the presidential Bush family. So, you know, there's these weird connections to our world and our reality and our lives. And I find that a little bit more interesting and rich than, like, just this kind of, you know, woo-woo, hey, here's Edgar Poe's ghost. You know, he's here, he's in Baltimore, he's in Virginia, he's everywhere. Some of the places we visit are very intense. And even in New York City, where, like, the streets are always awake and always alive and always bright, you can still feel something at some of these locations. I will use the word, like, a vibration, for lack of a better word. It probably makes me sound a little, now I'm getting woo-woo myself, but some of these places do have a very intense vibration and a very ominous feeling to them. And I'm not dismissive of ghosts at all. I'm not dismissive of the possibility that the spirit world continually intrudes on our material world. Not at all. I do think there's something there. And I don't think that we know the mysteries of all the universe. And I don't think that a place can have been as continuously inhabited as New York City and not leave a little bit of psychic residue.
Andrea, could you share with us one of your favorite stories from your tours?
For a long time, I have been obsessed with the story of Jan Bryant Bartell. Jan Bryant Bartell is a woman who lived on West 10th Street in Greenwich Village in the late 50s through to the early 70s, late 60s, early 70s. And she moved into a house at 16 West 10th Street in 1957. She moved into that house with her husband, Fred, who was a restaurateur, and he was away from home a lot. If you know anyone who works in the restaurant business, you know they work long hours, they work late hours, and they're often working evenings and weekends. So Jan, who was primarily a housewife, she also was a bit of an artist. She dabbled in poetry and playwriting and acting, singing and composition, but primarily she was at home quite a bit. And she was also a very kind of sensitive person. And she swore they were in a converted attic in a brownstone on 16th Street. And they're up in this attic from a house, you know, the house is from the 1860s, and so it's old and it's crooked and the attic is narrow and musty, and she swears she can feel a presence in the attic. And because she's a very kind of creative, sensitive soul, you know, her husband he's more pragmatic and down to earth, and he tends to dismiss what he considers to be sort of like her imaginings, you know? And so when she insists that, like, she can smell a vapor of phantom perfume or sees a whiff of dissipating smoke, or that there's a dark shadow hovering over her bed, you know, her husband's a little bit like, yes, dear, sure there is. You know, or she'll be like, my dog, you know, the dog won't go into this room or won't go into this chair, or growls at empty space. And Fred's like, well, you know, dogs growl. She would see little things, like once she saw what appeared to be a shriveled up grape in the middle of her kitchen table that hadn't been there a second ago, and she thought it was an aport, which is like an object transported from the spirit world. She said that she saw orbs. She claimed to hear the sound of glass breaking, just when nothing had actually broken in the house. It was just a phantom sound of glass shattering. She had a couple of maids to help her clean her house, which I think is fabulous. Like, you just are home all day and you have someone come over to clean your house. I love it. Oh, it's so decadent. Anyway, that's my fantasy. So she has a maid to come clean her house. This woman, she is actually from South Carolina, and she's very comfortable with the idea of spirits in the spirit world, and she's very casual, and she mentions to Jan, like, oh yeah, you know, there's a spirit cat I saw this little white spirit cat in your kitchen. You know, it's fine. It's no big deal. Just FYI, you have a ghost cat. And, also there's a woman in white standing in there as well. So, we cool? Jan's like, nope, we are not cool. I do not like this woman in white in my kitchen. I do not like this ghost cat. My dog does not like this ghost cat. And I really want to have someone come and investigate this apartment. It takes an eyewitness moment for her husband to actually get on board with this. And they are sitting in front of their fireplace. And this is another thing I'm super jealous of, is that they have a built-in fireplace in their apartment, a working wood-burning fireplace, in November of 1963. So they've been living in this apartment for 5 years. And Jan's very much at the end of her rope by this point. Like, she's so tightly wound at this point, like, she's basically just getting through the day by doing a lot of Valium. And, it's the early 60s. She's a housewife. She has pots of Valium in her house. So she's just barely hanging on here. And one day they're home, they're relaxing, and Fred's got this rare evening off from the restaurant. And he finally sees something that convinces him there's a spirit entity in the house. And what he sees is their dog start to just suddenly, out of nowhere, stand up on its hind legs and raise its hackles, raise its haunches, its fur's all standing on end. It starts to growl, and it's staring into space, apparently. It's looking at nothing, and its eyes are just following this invisible entity around the room. And it comes to rest, the dog's gaze comes to rest in this one corner of the room that Jan had always said the dog refused to go to. And she had also said this was the corner of the room where she had seen these dark shadows hovering on the walls. And the dog is just staring and growling, and the eyes of its whites are exposed, and its teeth are exposed, and its mouth is foaming. And Fred's like, oh my God, he's like, oh, what is happening? And Jan very calmly is like, this is what I've been trying to tell you. So this moment finally convinces Fred to get on board, and they have a psychic come and read the house. And it's funny because the person who comes to their house is a guy named Hans Holzer. And Hans Holzer was a very, very well-known self-styled ghost hunter back in that era. And he brought one of his favorite mediums, I think it was Mrs. Ethel Myers, I believe, was the medium that he brought to the house. And so the medium read the house, said, yes, it's definitely haunted. And this was in late November of 1963. I think they actually had their seance on November 23rd, which is an interesting date. It's the date after Kennedy was assassinated. So it was a very weird, dark day in American history. And they're sitting in their room having this seance. It must have felt incredibly surreal. And the psychic is telling her all this stuff about the house and the woman who haunts it. And so eventually they move out. Jan actually fully doesn't believe everything the psychic says, but they end up moving out. And they live on the Upper West Side for a little while, and then they decide to move back to the village. I'm not sure why. Jan just seems sort of compelled to move back to this neighborhood that she's really drawn to emotionally. And she moves back to, and this is really astonishing, not just Greenwich Village, not just West 10th Street, but 14 West 10th Street, which is literally right next door to her old house. She's literally sharing a wall with her old apartment because she's on the other side of the wall now. And so, she moves into 14 West 10th Street, and 14 West 10th Street is an address that has been referred to as the House of Death. This house got a really terrible reputation in 1989 when an awful murder happened there. There was a man named Joel Steinberg who beat his 6-year-old daughter to death in that location. So it became known as the House of Death thereafter. But even before the horrible Joel Steinberg murder, even before then, there was already a little bit of a pall over that house. It had a strange reputation and had long been considered haunted for reasons that aren't fully clear. It also had a bit of a literary imprimatur. Mark Twain lived in that house for a year. 1900 to 1901, I believe Mark Twain lived there. He had the whole entire house, and by the 60s it had been subdivided into apartments. And Jan became quite obsessive and quite very weird as soon as she moved into that house. She'd always been very tightly wound. She'd always been a little, in her own kind of world. By the time she moves into 14 West 10th Street, she's really just paranoid, constantly terrified, convinced that the house is trying to kill her, and that there's, the house is under the spell of something, that is obsessed with her death and wants her to die and wants everyone in the house to die, that they have just moved into this place that has an active kind of will of its own, as though the house has its own, being, as though it's sentient. And Fred at this point is just like, I really need to move out of the city. It's the late 60s. A lot of people are fleeing New York City anyway. New York City is really kind of hit its nadir at that point. It's, it's a dangerous place to live, really. People are getting mugged, and, Washington Square is just like where you go to score drugs. It's not like it's a place that a lot of people are leaving anyway. So Fred is ready to go, and even Jan at this point is ready to go. She starts having these awful nightmares where she goes to, there's a church across the street called the Church of the Ascension. And she has these dreams that she's at her own funeral in that church. And she's just getting more and more intense and paranoid and weird. And Fred's like, we're going. So they move to the suburbs, a place called New Rochelle, which is in Westchester. It's nice. It's suburban. It's totally not haunted. They're in a beautiful new home. Jan writes this memoir of her experiences. She phrases it, my time that I touched the hem of the psychic tapestry while living on West 10th Street. So, that's her writing style. She wrote this book. It's called Spindrift. Spindrift is a really bizarre memoir of her experiences, and it has a really strange twist ending. She ends up finishing her memoir and submitting the manuscripts to her publisher in 1973 or 74 in the spring. And within months of submitting her manuscript, by June of that year, she is found dead in her home of an apparent heart attack. It's like as soon as she finished the book, then she died. And the last lines of the book are, writing this book for me, dear reader, has been a kind of exorcism. But perhaps for you, the haunting has just begun. And it's almost like she's cursing you. And truly, if you ever visit that locality, and if you're a little bit psychically sensitive, you probably will feel a little strange there. It has made some of my guests on my tours feel like a little bit sick or a little bit upset. Some of my guides are particularly affected by it. And if you ever read the book, it will cast a kind of spell on you where you will become obsessed with Jan, quite possibly. I find this story really compelling because there are so many factors that I'm personally fascinated by in that story, like the idea of the city itself kind of wrapping its arms around you. The very New York story of moving into a place that has been previously inhabited. We're a city of renters. And you move into a house and you kind of inherit all that it comes with. Whoever lived there before you, they leave their energy in that house. And, we're all just tenants in this life. And Jan herself, the way she interacts with that home and with that space and the way it affects her and her own personality. And then the idea of her very staid husband, her kind of material-minded husband, there's this gaslight quality to it where, she literally is the crazy woman in the attic at a certain point. So, it's a really interesting story. It's very strange. And it really is, the funny thing about it, it's kind of unsolved because there's a lot of ghost tours in the city that will be like, 22 different people died here and that's why this house is haunted. But in fact, that's not really an origin story. Any middle class or upper middle class family home that dates from the mid 19th century is going to have had a lot of deaths in it necessarily because people died at home back then. Unless you were very poor, you didn't go to a hospital if you were sick. You were treated in your own bed. You stayed at home. That's what proper people did. So there necessarily would have been dozens of deaths in any home. So, there's no real kind of origin story about that place. It just almost seems haunted by itself. It really is a house with a will of its own. It's very strange. And you kind of have to see it and feel it to believe it.
For our listeners in New York City, or those who may be visiting soon, where's the best place for people to find more information about what you're up to?
You should head over to boroughsofthedead.com and check out our website. We have all of our tours listed by location, and we also have our full calendar of upcoming public tours. So right now we're listing all of our tours through the end of October, and as you can imagine, it's packed. So we're running pretty much everything that we're offering at the moment. But yeah, boroughsofthedead.com.
A big thank you to Andrea and all of our friends at Boroughs of the Dead. Would love to check out their wide variety of tours there in New York City, such a historically rich and fascinating place. As always, thank you to our intrepid audio editor, Michelle Dennis, Jillian Walker-Chuck, our expert guest wrangler, and Kevin MacLeod at Incompetech.com for the additional music. Information about all our tours can be found on our website, which is hauntedwalk.com. If you have been on one of Boroughs of the Dead's walking tours, we would love to hear about your experience. Be sure to connect with us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, all at Haunted Walk. Also remember to leave those 5-star reviews on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening to us, as we strive to hit 55-star reviews before the end of August. Until we meet again next week, sweet dreams.